welcome all of you, both in person and online, to what I think will be a wonderful event. I'm Dana Goldman. I'm the Dean of the USC Saul Price School of Public Policy. And we all know Los Angeles is a city of stories, but the one you're going to hear tonight may be one of its most important ones. We're best known for Hollywood, but in many ways it's Long Beach, Downey, and El Segundo that have most shaped our city. But I'll leave it to our A-list of panelists to tell the rest of this story. I do want to thank some folks for coming out. We're especially grateful to have Spectrum One News here this evening. Spectrum is our media partner on this event and will be rebroadcasting tonight's discussion. And this event couldn't be possible without the generous support of Dennis and Brooks Holt, who are here with us. This is part of our Holt Distinguished, yes, it's okay to clap. This is part of our Holt Distinguished Lecture Series, which focuses on communications, public policy, and politics. Past speakers have included such luminaries as LeVar Burton, Gretchen Carlson, Nate Silver, and Dana Perino. And Dennis also, I should point out, is a proud former member of the USC baseball team as well. So and a longtime member of our Price School Board of Counselors. And finally, I want to thank our Price School Presidential Scholar in Residence, Jane Harman. She'll be serving as our moderator. She's been the driving force behind organizing this wonderful event. Congresswoman Harman served with distinction for 9 terms as the representative for California's 36th district, which is home to many from the local aerospace industry. She was first elected to the House in 1993, and she went on to serve 4 years as the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. She's also served on advisory boards for the CIA, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Departments of Defense, Homeland Security, and State. She is the current chair of the Freedom House Board of Trustees. It's no wonder she's widely recognized as a top-flight expert at the intersection of security and public policy issues. I'll now turn it over to Congresswoman Harman. Thank you.
So thank you, Dana. Thank you to the Holts. Thank you to this audience, and especially the ROTC folks. Congratulations to you. This is a great place to be, and I hear you're over 250 strong, women and men, which of course pleases me a lot. Our country's future security depends on you, so great that you're doing what you're doing. Good evening. I am a huge admirer, I'm looking down the row here, of those on today's panel who, with me, played key roles in protecting and enhancing the legacy of aerospace in Southern California. Aerospace was and is the crown jewel of the South Bay economy and the feeder system for talent educated at USC, among other schools. Aerospace played a key role in ending the Cold War and since, declaring a peace dividend following the end of the Cold War and making dramatic cuts to federal defense and intelligence procurement budgets turned out to be very short-sighted. The threats did not go away and in many ways became harder to track. That dynamic became clear to the world on 9/11. And the aerospace industry was a critical resource used to track down Osama bin Laden. Anyone watching geopolitics today knows that our technological capabilities, especially in space, must be safeguarded more carefully than ever before. Each panelist joining us tonight, including Leon Panetta, there he is. Hello, Leon. Can you see him on the screens? You have to see Leon Panetta. Yay. Each panelist joining us tonight has provided leadership to guarantee that aerospace remains central to the U.S. military and economic playbook and the economic driver of a major portion of the Southern California economy. You heard Dana say that entertainment is what LA seems to be known for? Well, as a representative of the South Bay all those 100 years I served in Congress, aerospace is what the South Bay is known for. So, our panel, our glorious panel today includes former Senator, did you remember that, and Governor Pete Wilson, former Congressman, OMB Director, CIA Director, and Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, who will be with us only for half an hour, so I'm going to talk faster, Leon. Former Congressman elected with me in the first post-Cold War class, and former Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Buck McKeon. Former President and CEO of TRW and Northrop Grumman and USC trustee Ron Sugar, and the rock star, my rock star, former administrator of the Aerospace Corporation in my congressional district, and former acting USC President Wanda Austin. And just remember, we're all proud Californians. So, as moderator, I will ask our panel a few questions, and then we will throw it open in some way that I don't really know because I won't be able to see you, but somebody will help me out here. So let me start with this question to all of you. Some of you were in senior government roles during the Cold War. At least two of you were. And all of you played key roles in the post-Cold War. Put us in the room. How did you see the challenges for California, especially for Southern California? For America, how did you see your own roles in addressing those challenges? Let's start with Governor Wilson. And you particularly were in the US Senate. You were just telling me some war stories about the Senate Armed Services Committee. But you were in the Senate during the Cold War. Then you were governor of California post-Cold War. And with me and others here, played a huge role in saving the aerospace industrial base. So how did you see the challenges then? What was it like?
Well, I came to the Senate about 2 years into the Reagan administration. And I had been privileged to serve with Governor Reagan when he was governor. And so this was a repeat. I had some idea of what to expect in terms of the man's mind and his personality. I knew that when he thought something had been decided, it should be followed. And when he did so, it usually made changes. And certainly that was true in this case. When he came to office, he was determined that the United States would be a power. It was already, to many degrees, a power, but he wanted them to be notable in terms of respect for specific changes. And the change that he wanted to make was to restore respect and, where needed, fear on the part of people who would pursue policies that were not democratic and were a threat to the free world. And we had just been through some of that in World War II. But he decided that when he came, he would be quite outspoken about it. And he was eloquent. When he went abroad, he said the same things that he said to the audience at home. And what he simply said was that in order for peace to exist, there had to be strength on the part of the people who most prize the strength. And what he was concerned with was that it was obvious that there were powers in the world that did not agree with that, who in fact were perfectly willing to try to engage in the kind of territorial challenge and in many cases grabbing. The sort of thing that we have since seen in this Ukraine-Russian conflict, very much the same. And what happened was that when he said officers in the United States Armed Services, while they are in the District of Columbia, will wear their uniforms proudly. And they did. And people liked it, including the people who were wearing the uniforms, because they saw a new respect. The other thing was that he made it clear that we were going to be a first-rate military power. That involved spending. That involved spending quite a lot. And he was well aware of it and prepared to argue as to why it was necessary. And he did so, I think, with great eloquence. He was a man who believed in peace. And in fact, when we finally achieved the advances in terms of our military capability, he did not lord it over those in the rest of the world. He simply wanted it made clear that if there were any trouble, we would prevail. And he was very much interested in seeing to it that we not just keep pace, but actually become a leader in the development of technologies. And that had a great deal to do with Southern California and the air industry here. It was already well established. I doubt that too many people in the room have any idea, really, when we began to be interested in aviation as something for protection. It was 1910. And if you go to San Diego, you will see that in 1911, the Navy had decided that they were going to be an air power as well. And the next year, it was the Marines. Anyway, they were all correct. But what happened is that President Reagan made it clear that he wanted us to be first in terms of power. We were a nation at peace. We were a nation that had prized peace. We had not too long before, certainly within the memory of the people who fought it, won World War II with our allies against people who were dictators, seeking land that was not theirs, seeking not just territories. How much am I allowed in terms of
just
time?
a little bit, because we're mindful of Leon's time.
Oh,
but
that's
this
right.
is excellent. I mean, none of us was born in 1910, I don't think. If you were, good for you. But this is also a former mayor of San Diego, in case you missed that. But I appreciate, I think this is really good to work us up to Leon, if it's okay, if I can just turn to my twin. We share a birthday. And so this has been going on for years and years. But Leon, you were in the House in the late 80s, or maybe even before. You left when Buck and I showed up. We took that personally. But then you went on to major roles, obviously, I just said this, in heading the CIA and as Secretary of Defense. So how did you see things then? And I'm going to ask you some more specific questions about your heroism during the 90s. But, could you just take what Pete Wilson has said to the next phase?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jane, for inviting me to participate with this distinguished panel, and my regards to all the members of the panel who are friends and have stood up for the aerospace industry in California. It did not take me long to understand, both in my time in the U.S. Army as well as in the Congress, and certainly as CIA director and then as Secretary of Defense, the importance of the aerospace industry to our national security. And in particular, how important the aerospace industry in Southern California was to our national security. Pete mentioned, it goes back to 1910, and it's true. We have a long record in Southern California of being leaders when it came to the aerospace industry. We were leaders when it came to commercial aircraft. We were leaders in World War II. I think there was something like 2 million aerospace workers produced something like 300,000 airplanes during World War II. In Southern California, it was one of the largest industries in the world at that time. And during the 80s, the aerospace industry was critical to our ability to confront the Cold War and face off against Russia. And 9/11 in particular reminded us of how important aerospace is to our national security. You're right. We could not have conducted the mission to go after Osama bin Laden were it not for the critical aerospace assets that we had, not only in being able to determine where bin Laden was located, but I just referred to the 2 helicopters who took the two teams of SEALs almost 150 miles into Pakistan to go after the compound where bin Laden was. We could not have done it without aerospace assets that were critically important to our national security. So it is important that we protect our aerospace industry, that we support it, because it's not only critical to our local economy in California, it is critical to our national security.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Buck, you and I were elected in the first post-Cold War class. You came from a different line of work. You might tell everybody what that was.
Cowboy boots.
Cowboy boots. Pretty cool. Cowboy boots and lots of kids. Patricia is also here. Buck was a very impressive fresh person in 1993. You went on to chair the House Armed Services Committee, HASC, which is a big deal. And in the 90s, you were there and way into the 2000s. But tell us what it felt like at the time, what the challenges were, and how you dealt with it.
You know, I relate to what it was like then and what it's like now. And when you and I came to Congress, we were able to reach out and talk to people across the aisle and get things done. Leon was the budget chairman for a very short time in '93.
He couldn't hold a job. He just
he moved to the White House. But he's had so many different jobs and probably, have you ever thought of running for president?
I'm too smart to do that at this point.
Yeah, I've had friends say, hey, why don't you run for president? I said, I thought you were a friend. Anyway,
okay.
When I came to Congress and Jane came to Congress, we had a national strategy. And it was to be able to fight 2 major wars in different parts of the world at the same time and win. That kind of faded to, well, we'll fight one and hold one. And I don't know what it is now. I know Secretary Austin came out a few months ago with probably this many pages of the strategy, and it's and this. I'm not saying anything derogatory about Secretary Austin. He's a fantastic general and a great Secretary of Defense, but we as a nation have really kind of fallen asleep at the wheel. And even though what we're spending now is more than we spent years ago, as a percentage of our gross domestic product, it's smaller. And a lot of it goes for things that have nothing to do with our national defense, but it gets in that bill because that's the bill that has to be passed. So I think that it's time for a wake-up call. It's wonderful seeing these young people in preparing to spend their lives defending ours. And I never wore the uniform except in ROTC. One year, I wasn't good at taking orders. But
That's for sure.
anyway, we've come a long ways, and especially here in Southern California.
So Wanda, I call Wanda the rock star for a reason. I've called her that for years. She was the head of the Aerospace Corporation, which is a federally funded research and development corporation. We have a number of them around the country. In El Segundo, in my former district, which was basically the research arm of what was then called the LA Air Force Base. And I remember when I first ran for Congress, people said, you have an Air Force Base in your district, but it doesn't have any runways. And you have to learn what it is. So I hope with a lot of help from Ron Sugar and others that I did. But Wanda, what was it like when you were there and since? And to remind everybody, Wanda also became the interim president of the University of California, which she did very effectively for a year plus at a time of great need for this university.
Jane, thank you. Thank you for convening us on this very important topic. There are two things that I would point out about the role of the aerospace industry in California. One is I'd remind people about the base relocation and closure effort that you led, and I know Leon helped with.
We're going to ask Leon about that in a minute.
To make sure
Yeah.
that that base remained there, and that because it was the heartbeat of the aerospace industry. Every aerospace firm had offices all up and down California, but particularly in that center. And if you understand the history of the Little Red Schoolhouse and the fact that General Schriever started the space base in a Little Red Schoolhouse on Inglewood Avenue, that was really how we birthed the Space Air Force, which today I think we all appreciate the importance of space in terms of its military capabilities, but also for its commercial capabilities and for its civil capabilities. And that were it not for the investment, for the innovation, for the convening of the technical talent in Southern California, we would not have the capabilities that we have today. And so this all works well together, that you've got commercial space, civil space, and military space, leveraging the technology, leveraging the talent, pulling people together to work on hard problems to ensure that as we all sleep at night, that we know very well what's going on around the world. So when we talk about air superiority, people understand what that means. But they don't necessarily understand what space superiority means and how important it is to being able to effectively support the Secretary of Defense to be able to know what he needs to know and do what he needs to do. Our competitors understand the importance of space. Our adversaries are trying to have space superiority and deny space superiority to the United States. And so I think it is more important today that we ensure and strengthen our defense capabilities and our industry capabilities, our industrial supply chain, to make sure that we continue to have the freedoms that we've had and enjoy.
Thank you. Oh, Ron, we're not leaving you out. Ron Sugar has held all the major CEO jobs in aerospace in the LA area, and he is a trustee at USC. I should have put that first. Excuse me, sorry. But at the time, I'm not sure, in the 90s or before, you were, why don't you just describe your career briefly and explain how industry saw the challenges here?
Yeah, this could go past Leon's bedtime because he's on the East
No,
Coast,
Leon
but-
gets the next specific question. Leon,
But
you're not
look, let me-
leaving yet. We know
Yeah,
it's 6:30.
let me tell it from two pieces.
Okay.
One is I was a little kid who drove to California from Canada in the back seat of an old 1950 Ford. We arrived in 1954. Some of you may not have been around in 1954. And it was really an amazing place, Southern California. The buzz, the vibe was amazing. All kinds of things happening here. In 1957, the Russians launched something called Sputnik. I've given talks to classes here at USC, and kids don't know what I'm talking about. But they did something we didn't expect them to do. And we basically had to have a response because we realized if they could launch a satellite that orbited the Earth, it could orbit half the Earth and come down on us with a nuclear weapon. And so therefore, we had to have something going on. I got very excited about this. It was a place of national importance. I was pretty good at math. I said, I want to be a rocket scientist. I want to do this, I want to do that. And in those days, we did something which we now call STEM, the California school system put tremendous investment in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and we all kind of moved up. I can't tell you the excitement. When I drove down El Segundo, I lived on the south central side of LA. Sometimes I drive it on El Segundo Boulevard, and there's this big Thor missile right in front of the little factory that the Wanda used to run. And I was thinking, wow, that's really cool. What's it doing there? What is it? I always tell people if I was raised in West Virginia, I'd be running a coal mine today. But since I was in Southern California, I'm in the aerospace industry. And I'll tell you, it was really exciting. And I think that what we don't realize is the enormous knock-on effect that this industry had in making Southern California really special. And when we had the setback in 1990, 1991, 92, with the funds coming down, we had a very significant recession here. We had significant layoffs. We had the Rodney King incident, which was horrible, but it was a catalyst that provoked massive set of civil disorder, which also related to the fact that the economy was now really gone down. People didn't realize how much it was important to have this industry for all of us in Southern California. But that was my experience in those days.
Well, we'll get to your corporate experience in a few minutes, but we're turning to you, Leon, before you bail on us. In the 90s, I mentioned this in my opening, when the Cold War ended, we decided that there would be peace in the world, and we downsized. This was during the administration of George Bush 41, not Reagan. We decided to declare a peace dividend and downsize the intelligence and defense procurement budgets, which meant downsizing the people. And then Buck and I were elected to Congress, and the triple PhDs who had won the Cold War were out in the cold. I mean, this was a devastating economic impact. And among other things that Congress did, I think it was in the 90s, maybe it was passed before that, was enact something called the Base Realignment and Closure Act, BRAC. And that could have, if it had applied to the LA Air Force Base, caused it to realign to another state. And so some of us were enormously concerned about this. And one of us, that would be Leon, was incredibly effective at saving the LA Air Force Base. And can you just talk about the 90s and the things you did? I think some of this was after you left OMB, when you were at before you rejoined government. So you were in the private sector doing all this good stuff.
Well, it actually began, Jane, when I was in Congress. And the BRAC, we went through 6 BRACs between 1988 and 2005 that almost decimated the military bases in California. As a result of BRAC, we closed more than 350 military bases in California. And California paid a higher price than any other state as a result of BRAC. And I can say that because in my district up in Monterey, we lost Fort Ord to BRAC recommendation. Fort Ord, the military base there, the home of the 7th Infantry Division, represented 25% of our local economy. So you can imagine the impact that had on our community. We were able, fortunately, to get a CSU campus, CSU Monterey Bay, to locate there, and it certainly helped on the recovery. In 2005, we went through another base closure round. Governor Schwarzenegger asked me to be chairman of the State Military Commission, working with communities to try to see if we could protect the few bases that were left in California. And one of those, obviously, was the LA Air Force Base. They had targeted that, as Jane knows. And the argument was it doesn't even have an airfield. How can it possibly be an air base? And fortunately, we were able, and it really was we, Jane and Buck and everybody who came together to argue that the LA Air Force Base was the nerve center for the California aerospace industry. We talked about its importance to space, to aerospace, to Vandenberg, to our national security. We had learned that the stronger argument in trying to protect a base is not the impact on the community, it's national security. And with the LA Air Force Base, we had a very strong argument to make to protect that. And to prove it today, as most of you know, that base is the home to Space Base Delta III and the Space Systems Command. And that is responsible for developing, equipping, and sustaining all of our space capabilities for our warfighters. And that command is now responsible for launch operations, for on-orbit checkouts, for testing, for sustainment of our satellite constellations and our space systems. It's about $11 billion in an acquisition budget. So I'm thankful that we were able to protect it. It is growing, it's a nerve center, and it is rebuilding the aerospace industry in California.
Leon, thank you very much for participating, and thank you for your enormous role in helping California.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Jane.
Bye-bye. So Pete Wilson, you did something else exactly at this time as governor, and that was you issued an executive order establishing the California Council on Defense Industry Conversion and Technology Assessment. It was a big deal, and it was certainly a big deal to Buck and me because you enacted this in March of 1993, just as we hit Congress, so you made us look really good. But here's the beginning of it, and it was very prescient. You said, whereas the California aerospace and defense-related industries and their workforce are national assets, and whereas it is in California's long-term interest to retain and redirect the vast human, technological, intellectual, and physical capital invested in the aerospace and defense industries, et cetera, you were calling on a diversification of the aerospace base. And one of the first things you and I worked on together was, nobody had ever heard of this before, something called dual-use technologies. It was using assets that were defense-related also for commercial application. And to remind, a lot of the satellite buses, the enclosure for satellites, could be used for either. But the stuff that you put in, the software, could be defense software or commercial software. And you were all over this. And thank you for what you did. Do you want to talk a little bit about this initiative you took?
Well, you've done a fine job. I was going to move to extend your time.
I'm offering you time.
Well, you have accurately portrayed the concern that we both had, and rightly so. Because what was necessary was to keep the talent that was already in the LA Air Force Base. People see the sign driving along the freeway and they say, where the hell is the Air Force Base?
Right.
Well, when we have the opportunity, we tell them. But actually, the point really was that there was extraordinary experience and talent. We had not only SC, but a number of other institutions that provided remarkable expertise. We didn't want them to go away. And many of them didn't want to go away. But Jane is right. Colorado was after it. So was New Mexico.
Right.
There were several eager people throughout this state that said, hey, why should it all be there in Southern California? We can do that. Well, no, they couldn't. And I'll tell you why they couldn't. Because the people who were at the LA Air Force Base did not want to leave. They were in a church that they liked. And more to the point, they wanted their children to be in that church. They wanted their children to be in the schools that they thought were really first rate. They wanted to do the things that they'd been doing in this community and doing them very well at the very same time that they were doing something that they knew was terribly important. And it was the importance of the work that they were doing that made it, I thought, imperative to make the kind of stand that Jane and several other people, Buck, I mean, you talk about people working together, they did, because they understood what was at stake. And it would have been a terrible thing. God knows how much time it would have cost in trying to reorient these people into the projects at which they were already deeply involved. Here, why move this?
Right.
Wasn't a good reason. And I will admit that I called on some people in Washington. I was then governor, but I had just come from Washington, and one of them said, "Now, you know, you're not supposed to talk to me about things like this." I said, "To the contrary, I am supposed to. I'm doing something in the national interest, and you're the only one that's hearing it. So if I can't trust you, we don't need to talk about anything that's secured. You know it and I know it. But what you really don't appreciate is the extent to which we would lose ground, lose time, if we were to allow the people who are here now to be reoriented, resituated in Colorado, in New Mexico, and there were others."
Alabama was another one.
That's right.
Yeah.
And in fact, as time has gone on, the southeastern United States have gotten into the act, and that's fine. But it was imperative to keep this base here.
Thank you. So Buck, you not only became chair of the House Armed Services Committee, but you went on to hold a major defense conference in Southern California after you left there. And I've heard you many times about the importance of a strong defense budget. You've already laid out kind of how you see the partial decline in our budget. But what I'd like to ask you more is my theory, which maybe you'd agree with or not, but it's not just that more is more, that more is better, better is better. And part of the challenge now is changing some of that budget so that the administrative bureaucratic piece is reduced and the warfighting capacity and the new technology is increased. And I would argue, and I just want to see if you agree with me, that we can do that very well in Southern California because, and I'm going to Wanda and Ron next because they do it, because we saved the aerospace base here. We have the capacity to build a much better defense budget. Do you agree?
Of course, and listening to Leon talk about Camp Roberts, that's where my dad did his basic training in World War II. Huh. And that's gone. That is not in our ability now to train people there. I mean, I think they did their best to make a lemonade out of a lemon and put the University of Monterey there, and I also served as chairman of the education committee. So they're both very important. But once you lose a facility, you can't go back. And World War II, I remember it. I was just a little kid, but I remember it. I watched the effect it had on my family. I watched the effect. My dad lost his best friend, who received a battlefield commission in Europe and was killed leading his men across a bridge. So my next brother was named John David after his friend. But once you lose the training facilities, and Duncan Hunter, when he was chairman, there was a big attempt to just about wipe out Camp Pendleton. I mean, think of how important that is, the beachfront and all of that. it's important for people that want to live on the beach, but you can't do assaults on a beach without a beach, and you can't train in those. And we've, with the years of having the wars out in the desert, we just about eliminated what the Marines' mission was. I remember serving or going out and visiting. They did a large joint effort with the services on the East Coast to get back to some of those basics. I went out and visited them when they were doing it. We had a one-star Marine, a one-star Admiral, and I asked them, I said, you know, when did you last participate in one of these? They said, we haven't. And they're leading it. And, you know, back at the start of World War II, we were ill-equipped, we were ill-trained, we were sending men over going through North Africa that it was just buying time. We can't afford that. And so while the BRAC had a good reason to try to save money, it did some damage too, and we can never replace that. What he talked about, Duncan, on Camp Pendleton, to protect the environment, you know, they've done different things, and he had a big chart, and he had an overlay that he would put on that this bill took this away, this bill took this away, so we still have Camp Pendleton, and they can still do things, but nowhere near what they could do in the past for training. So it does cost money. You have to spend money, and some people say, well, you're just doing it to create jobs. I said, no, you're doing it for our national interest. It's just a side benefit, a very good side benefit, that it does create good jobs because they are doing important things. So I think that I was going to show you a chart. Go to the internet and look up the U.S. national debt clock and see how fast that wheel's turning. When we came to Congress, we actually, in the next few years, working with President Clinton, we had a divided government, but we passed a balanced budget. We
did.
And we paid off some of the national debt. I don't know when that had ever happened before. I know it hasn't happened since. And the debt at that time was a few $1 trillion. It is now 31 trillion, and the clock's going like this. You know how long it takes to pay off $1 trillion? You've probably heard that little example too. If you take a second and count 1 million seconds, it takes about 8 days. Then if you go to 1 billion, it takes a few years. When you go to 1 trillion, it's hundreds of years. I mean, it's I don't know how we're ever going to do it unless we come to a real understanding of our financial situation, how to get it in order, and national defense has to be a strong part of it.
Well, part of my argument that I'm sure you agree with too is that part of national security is economic security. And I was proud to vote for the balanced budget amendment. I was proud to be a blue dog in Congress, a group of Democrats focused on financial responsibility, fiscal responsibility. But Wanda, onto my better is better thing. Current and future wars are not going to be fought the old way. This is not to knock the importance of training, but technology does play and will play a huge role. And you were in the technology biz as a systems engineer at the Aerospace Corp and since in various activities. Can you talk a little bit about technology and the role it plays here in the South Bay and in Southern California, and what you were able to do during the years you headed the Aerospace Corporation?
So Jane, you know, technology is really important. Before I go to that, I want to go back to Camp Roberts, because that is where I learned to operate defense communication satellites. It was a strategic location where we could access our satellites.
And what were you doing there? How old were you? I mean, what was your, how old were you?
She was younger than
What was your role there? I've rephrased it. What was your role?
Literally, as a systems engineer, what you want to understand is how well your systems are operating. If you have a problem, how do you detect it? What do you do about it? And so, it's a long way from here to that satellite. And so you have to be very thoughtful and leverage the technology to be able to make sure our systems operate. Why is that important? Well, because if you want to go and find Osama bin Laden, and you're relying on satellite systems to give you information about what's going on and who's where and what's happening, those systems have to work every time, and you have to be able to rely on them. And so that's the key part of the technology and why it's so important. But the thing that I would also say about technology is that it's complementary to civil communications, to civil space, to commercial space. And so when I look back at my time, we had complex problems about space launch. How do you make sure they're successful when they get off the ground? And to make sure that they operate. And that they operate through whatever environment they may be in, whether there's someone else up there who's doing things that you need to know is going on. So the technology is very important. But what you get from thinking about it more holistically is that you get the benefit of people who are working on different aspects of the problem. So the United States government would never have paid for us to figure out how to land the first stage of a rocket, as we did this week with SpaceX, I think, for the 100th time. That's a huge savings, but it's also leveraging the technology. When I was on the Human Spaceflight Committee, we talked about the fact that if we keep spending money on shuttle, we don't get to spend money to get to Mars and solve other hard problems. That was a hard call to make, but it gave the commercial industry an opportunity to step up and bring their expertise to bear to make sure that we were able to invest in the future. And so the point I would make to this audience today is leadership matters. You need to make hard decisions. You need to make the trade-offs and the investments for the future. You need to invest in the talent. You need to provide the resources for them to be trained and get the expertise that they need. But you have to do that so that when you need it, it's there. You can't wait to say something bad happened yesterday and think that you're going to be able to snap your fingers and have that capability be there. It does not work that way. That is not the way to invest for our future. So I would say, and you wrote the foreword to my book about we have to make space for leadership to solve complex problems. And that's what system engineering is all about, is to really think a few steps ahead and say, what do we need to do today to make sure we have the capabilities that we need 10, 15 years from now?
So you made reference to the commercial sector, which has played a huge role in the aerospace story. Getting to you, Ron, I just have to tell one little story, which is that in El Segundo, back in the day when I was in Congress, there was this kid who had rented some property with sawdust on the floor, and he had this crazy idea that he was going to build cheaper rockets with Russian technology in this space. And I met him. His name is Elon. And he had not even started the car business. And he somehow, amazingly, a hugely bright man. You can have whatever views you have about some of the things he says, but his ideas for this were extraordinary. And he made a huge success out of it. And the story is the story. But turning to you, Ron, you played a role, a major role, in a variety of companies along the way. The last one was Northrop Grumman, and you're on a number of boards as well. But in the 90s, Bill Perry, then a Californian, then the Secretary of Defense, had a dinner. And I think it was in 1994, and it was called The Last Supper. And he invited a number of, this is not a religious story, he invited a number of aerospace executives to this dinner. The basic message was, if you don't merge with each other, you'll die. And since you have been in several of these companies, can you tell that story and tell how private industry has really helped make all of this work?
Yeah, so building upon what Buck and the governor and Leon talked about, the buildup of the defense business, the defense industry, and the industrial base to win the Cold War, the reward was we got to now dismantle the industrial base that had won the Cold War, have the peace dividend. And the challenge was we had massive overcapacity, not just in our bases militarily, but in our industry as well. And so we were very fortunate at that time. It was 1993, actually, I think, Jane, where Dr. Bill Perry, who was Deputy Secretary of Defense, later became Secretary of Defense, but came out of industry, out of Silicon Valley. So he had an understanding of industry and business and technology, as well as government, said, look, we can't have all of you. So he invited, of the 107 major defense contractors, he invited the CEOs of the top 30 defense companies to come to the Last Supper in Washington. And he said, you're not going to like what I'm going to have to tell you, but at the end of the day, the budget's coming down dramatically. About a third to a half of the industrial capacity of this nation is going to be removed. Now, we can do it by us directing to you who goes out of business, which we're not going to do. We can allow a political free-for-all where the representatives of the various districts can push and shove to protect their own industries, which would not be optimum for the national security. Or we can basically say, you guys figure it out, and what we'll do from the government standpoint is not stand in your way when you decide to merge companies. And at the end of the day, rather than having 5 or 6 air-to-air missile manufacturers, there'll be at most 2. We'd like to have competition, but no more than 2. Airframe manufacturers, naval submarine manufacturers, destroyer manufacturers, and you name it. And so everybody was shaken by that, the CEO group. I was not in that dinner because I was like one level below at that time, but I have 12 eyewitness representatives who've told me, and Bill Perry himself shared with me what actually happened. And what happened was that the leaders of the industry went back, they thought about it, they said, okay, we're either going to have to take our industry, our company, and grow it or exit it. And we can't sit here and all be sick, and we can't have a nation of sick industrial base. And the process actually amazingly worked. So what happened? Northrop looked at Grumman. Lockheed and Martin came together. A number of companies decided they were not going to stay in the business, they're going to exit. Who were they? IBM exited the defense business. General Motors exited defense business. TI, Texas Instruments, exited. And Westinghouse exited. And there was a complete rearrangement of the chessboard. But the forces of let me just say, of capitalism under the benign leadership of the Defense Department at that point in time allowed a problem to be solved where those who exited were rewarded and those who acquired, like Northrop, Lockheed, General Dynamics, and Boeing, were also rewarded over time, and we had an industry with much smaller numbers of much stronger financially resilient players. Now, you could argue that the industry is too concentrated now and that there's not enough competition, but the fact is there is competition. We went down to one large rocket manufacturer, a combination between Boeing and Lockheed, United Space Alliance, and then in comes somebody like Elon Musk or Bezos or you name it. And things are always changing, and where you think you have a competitive advantage on one thing, suddenly you have other companies arising. So I think the thing that makes our country's industrial base strong is a combination, when it's done right, of benign government oversight and technological supremacy and capitalist forces allowing free enterprise to take its natural step.
So I have one final question, hoping for short responses before we go to your questions. And then we'll allow for all of you to make some closing remarks. But my final question is this. I did not introduce any of you by party affiliation. I don't even know the party affiliation of several people on this panel. I know the elected officials because you have to declare that. But I really don't know. And frankly, my view is you're wonderful people, so that's what I care about. And country over party is something I always talk about. But just a little riff on how our politics has changed and what its impact is on the topic we're talking about, which is our national security and certainly our economic prosperity in the aerospace industry. Let's start with you, Pete.
Well, partisanship is not new. It's old. But what is important is that there be cooperation in the public interest. And sometimes those that have a district that is, let's say, 35 to 65. That's 5 more than we, that's never. Anyway, it's different if they have a district that is 90 to 10. You probably won't get too much compromise out of the latter. You'll get more out of the other. And what you should strive for is finding common ground that will benefit both. And it's not easy. It is not easy. I had a short list of people in the Senate whom I did not like and did not trust intellectually. And we won't go into who they were or what their party
Sure,
affiliation
they were all
was.
Republicans.
No, there weren't enough Republicans. No, but the point is really, you should put first the national interests. And it is not too difficult to figure it out, although people argue about it and argue honestly, if not intelligently. What you really have to do is be realistic. You have to understand that you should, as you have put it, Jane, put the nation first. And what Bill said to you at the, what did they call
The
it?
Last Supper.
The Last Supper,
Bill
yeah.
Perry, yeah.
Bill Perry.
It sounds to me as though at the dinner which he threw, he was not only making a lot of sense, but was being honest and saying that we can't continue spending money even when it is well spent. We don't need to have 3 or 4 of the same. We need to have what we need to have. And that doesn't mean we should shortchange it. I have tended to err on the side, well, I don't think it's erring either, of making damn sure that we are spending enough money so that we are in the vanguard technologically, so that we can't find ourselves on the short end. And it seems to me that what Bill Perry was saying is we're going to try to do that, and we're going to have to cut. So you should be part of the cutting process so that it makes sense. And I'm sure not everybody that left that dinner was happy. Probably far from it. But my God, you can't simply go on spending. And the question is, when is the day of reckoning? Well, it's come and people are ignoring it.
Right.
And that is not in the best interest of the nation or the best interest of the free world.
Thank you. So, Buck, any comments on the lack of bipartisanship? And we'll go to audience questions.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this, and I think there are some things that could be done to change it. Because when we were there were conservative Democrats and there were moderate Republicans, and a lot of times you have to work with that middle to get things done, and especially with divided government, where you share the blame and everybody steps up to the table and takes a piece of the knife. But I do know a couple of things that would be helpful. When they eliminated earmarks, people didn't understand what earmarks were. It all had a bad name. It all came to a bridge in Alaska. There were 10,000 earmarks that year, and that one wasn't even an earmark. It was what did we do on the committees that weren't appropriators? It was just in an authorization bill.
Yeah.
So what they need to do, I think, is Congress in the Constitution spends the money. Well, bureaucrats in Washington spend the money. So what they need to do is make congressmen have a little part. And I used to get earmarks for my district, not very many because I was pretty new, but I would go to my city leaders, I would ask them, what do you want if I'm able to get some money? I wasn't picking out things I wanted. I went to the local leadership and I got it. And then if I got some money in a bill, I would divide it equally between the different cities, not just where I lived. Anyway, that, I think, if they could get back to earmarks, responsible earmarks with controls that there's not wasted money, that was the knock on it. But actually, it was such a small part of the overall budget, it didn't really mean much except politically. So that's one thing. Another thing, when I was first in Congress, the chairman of the Armed Service Committee, we used to go on a lot of trips, and they were bipartisan trips. And you get to know, Republicans get to know Democrats, Democrats get to know Republicans. Once you get to know somebody, it gets pretty hard to call them some of the names that they call each other now. President Clinton was president at the time. I thought the things that were said about him, I probably think and probably could realize that there's no one person in this room that's perfect. I think there was only one that ever lived on this earth, and they crucified him. So I think treating people as human beings, they have families, they have children, and calling them some of the names they call, I think Codell's would help get people back where they used to live in Washington, and they used to socialize together. They don't do that anymore. Some of them won't even ride in an elevator with somebody in the other party.
We need to get to questions, but on that point, some good news. I just got back from my 22nd time at the Munich Security Conference, which is viewed as the world's #1, and it's a fabulous security conference in Munich, Germany. There were 50 members of Congress there who came on congressional delegations, bipartisan, 30 members of the Senate, and they were all together. And just maybe it will improve the atmosphere a little bit.
Those are the things they need to do.
Questions? I'm not sure how to recognize you. Oh, we have a microphone. Okay, please stand up, identify yourself, and ask a question.
My name is Dan. I'm an engineer here at USC. I work in the Aviation Safety and Security program. And one of the things we do at our program is we educate a lot of our allied military partners, especially from NATO, Southeast Asia, et cetera. And a lot of them have a presence at the bases, specifically the Dutch Air Force and the Royal Air Force have a squadron up at Edwards Air Force Base. What role do those allied partnerships play when you're deciding whether you want to grant a contract or close military base or do other things like that where they're kind of counting on us to have that facility there for them?
Wanda, you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take that. So I think you raised a really key point. It's one point I wanted to make, which is we do work with our allies. And to your question about the politics, when you go outside the boundaries of the U.S., people are looking at us to say, what's the right way to approach this? What's the right way to work together? They're looking at us to bring that leadership. And I think that's one of the reasons why we need our Congress to work. You can have differences, but it needs to work. With respect to allies, I've been at many sites where we're expecting to fight war together, we're expecting to maintain peace together, we have to exercise together, and so we have to have our allies physically located with us. And they have to have access. So we have to have trust so that they can have access to the systems that they need to have so we can make good decisions. So I think this is part of the solution, which is to recognize that in the real world, we all have to work together. Somebody sneezes on the other side of the world, we learn we're all going to get a cold. So let's figure it out up front and figure out how to work together to solve problems by working closely with our allies and making sure that we're sharing information. It's to our benefit and it's to their benefit.
How about a question from one of our ROTC folks? Are you one of them? I can barely see there. Over here.
Good evening, ma'am. So I've been an intern at Northrop Grumman for the past 4 years.
Oh, good choice. What's your name?
My name is Cadet Madden, and I have been a systems engineer. I've absolutely loved it. Met a lot of people my age that are willing to work in the aerospace industry. So what do you need from us in order to usher in the new era of innovation and
Ron.
development as the aerospace industry evolves?
We need more of you. We love what you bring. The stunning thing is that when people like you come in, even though you're young, you're at the very beginning of your career, you're bringing a remarkable set of new skills which are fresh and really help us move forward. And if you talk about this dual use discussion, which we talked about earlier, I think Jane talked about it, you know, if you think about the complexity of an iPhone versus the complexity of the onboard processor of a satellite that Wanda and I might make, there's a lot of synergy there. And I think bringing the best practice, best technology that you can, bringing artificial intelligence, machine learning, other things that you're very fresh in from your university experience is also very helpful.
I am delighted to see the ROTC representation here tonight from all the services. I got my college education from a program that was called the Holloway Plan. And it was named for Admiral Holloway, who said, you know, we've got a certain number of people graduating from the Naval Academy, but not enough, and they're not all going to stay. So we need to have people who are educated reservists we can call upon in time of need. And that's how I got my education. The agreement was you serve 3 years active duty, and if you want to stay, you can. If you graduate with a regular commission, well, I decided to tender my regular commission, but I agonized about it, and we were apparently a long way, I thought, from anything like combat. So I went ahead, went to law school. When I got to law school, the first place I called was the Marine Corps Reserve unit nearby. And I said, I'm calling because I want to be on the list and want to be an active reservist. He said, okay, Lieutenant, I'll put you on the list, but we got a pretty long list. A long list. They called me 2 weeks before I graduated. But it was a wonderful thing. I could take my commission as an ensign or as a second lieutenant. I took it as a second lieutenant, and it was a part of my learning experience in addition to getting a otherwise good college education.
Terrific. Okay, last question.
Good evening. I'm Cadet Gillinger with the Air Force ROTC. Since the end of World War II, American foreign policy has been pretty consistent and even a point of bipartisanship. However, today, with, as you have said, the lack of bipartisanship and maybe even a rise in isolationist sentiment, do you see that this will remain the case going forward?
Buck, why don't you try that one?
I couldn't hear the question.
Really?
Well, then you're never going to pass the physical.
No, it was, yeah. Why don't you repeat the short part?
So since the end of World War II, American foreign policy has been pretty consistent and even a point of bipartisanship. However, as you said, with the seeming lack of bipartisanship today and maybe even a rise in isolationist sentiment, do you see this being the case going forward?
I do see change. We have a lot of people in the Congress now that have served in uniform. In fact, the congressman that represents the district I served in was one of my first appointees to the military academy. He went to Annapolis, flew F-18s out in the desert, over 30 combat missions. Then he went to work for Raytheon, had a really good job, gave that up to run for Congress, and he's a great congressman. And I think a guy like that has served is going to reach across the aisle to Democrats that have served. That's a start. It has to come from somebody, a catalyst, getting it started. Your compatriots here can be a catalyst. Everybody here, write to your congressman and say, we'd like to see you get along a little better.
Yes, do it. And be sure to vote. You can't opt out. We only have a couple of minutes, so if anyone here is dying to make a comment, make an additional comment. If you're not dying to make a comment, I'll make a comment. And that is about what this questioner was also asking, I think, which is that we had a strategy after World War II, which some call the liberal world order, which kept the world pretty peaceful for a long time. Not absolutely peaceful, but for a long time. Given recent developments, and by the way, Pete, I see your Ukraine pin, and I think we're all with you on that. Given recent developments, it is important to think anew about what is our strategy going forward. The world has changed. There are peer competitors or near peer competitors of the United States, especially China. And there are reasons why we should fear China. There are also reasons why we should try where we can to compete with and cooperate with China. Think climate on cooperation. But at any rate, we need a better strategy. This is what I would say. And looking out at this room, people, not just those of you who are picking military careers in the short term or longer term, but everybody else who goes to this fabulous university and appreciates what aerospace has contributed here, play a role, get in the game, and don't do it on a partisan basis, because that's just not as constructive as thinking about what does our country need? How can we meet new threats and challenges? How can we figure out a new nuclear doctrine, because the other one is in shreds, unfortunately? How can we figure out some kind of a regime for cyber and AI so that we don't end up in a place where machines driven by machines are unleashed against us? How do we think about these problems in new ways? And I'm really proud of this little role I play at USC. Thank you, Dana, and everybody else. But I'm really proud to be with people like this who have been the leaders in this aerospace sector that has made huge parts of LA and the South Bay and Southern California so successful for so long. And so I would just ask you all to salute them.